Howdy, everyone. Welcome to the game room / bar, where we're going to talk about climate change. My name is Andres Clarence, and I am a professor in engineering systems and environment, and I'm joined here by my three favorite people at the university, with the exception of Karen and Jonah.
Watch out.
Wow.
Real team approach.
So many favorites, they're all my favorites. And we are going to talk about ways that data scientists can engage on the problem of climate change. And climate change is a big problem, and it is here now, and it's impacting us in ways seen and unseen. So some of the ways that are seen are what's happening in California right now, where pretty much every time I open the news, there's a new fire that's sprung up, and there's all kinds of complex dimensions to what's happening in California around drought, around infrastructure and the power grid. Some of it's engineering and technical, some of it's meteorological, some of it is economic. But there are impacts everywhere. So if any of you are from Houston, you know that a couple of years ago, Houston got a hurricane that dumped multiple feet of rain in a very short period. We had similar types of events happening in North Carolina. Puerto Rico almost got blown off the map. So there's the extreme weather component to this, which is really significant. There's what's happening on the coasts. But there are, of course, impacts to food systems, transportation systems, public health that are really profound and really both an enormous challenge and an enormous opportunity. And so I think that within the community of folks that think about climate change, we look at adaptation as one dimension of this, so figuring out ways to basically modify and improve and enhance our capability to respond to some of these events, and that's where sort of the scholarship around resilience comes from. But there's also a separate effort and focus on efforts to sort of slow climate change, because climate change is not this sort of situation where we're going from one equilibrium to another. We are in a situation that's really just ramping up emissions, and so things are going to accelerate unless we take action to slow them. So the point is that adaptation by itself is not going to be enough, that we have to do some mitigation as well as adaptation. And so today we want to focus primarily on that mitigation piece, even though there are great opportunities for data science to engage with both. We're going to focus on the mitigation primarily because it's what I know most about. And so the challenge for us today, or what we wanted to do with this hour, was try and see if we could, with this conversation with you all, engage, talk about ways that UVA could be a leader in this area. And I think that there are a lot of dimensions that or things about UVA that we have that position us well to be a research leader here. So I'm in the engineering school. I am very involved in the Environmental Resilience Institute, and so we're sort of like a little brother to DSI, little sister. We came up a few years after DSI, but we have ramped up over the past 2 years quite a bit of research capability, and the flavor of research that we do is interdisciplinary, and that's important because none of these problems, or very few of these problems, can be solved by a single discipline. And DSI, I think, has been a real leader at that in UVA in terms of the way that they've created these graduate fellowships that go and they create these sort of convergent teams that are working in really different but complementary spaces and ways. And I think that style of research is one that is necessary for this type of work. Within the engineering school, we have the Link Lab that focuses on cyber-physical systems, which many of you, I'm sure, are aware of, but that's a real opportunity. UVA has a traditional strength in transportation engineering, so that's a really critical area that we need to address, and there are opportunities there. My own department civil and environmental engineering merged with systems engineering because we recognize that a lot of the grand challenges in the environmental domain are systems problems that are not that you need to look at in a particular way. Lisa and I do a lot of work on life cycle analysis, which is a particular tool within sort of systems thinking. We've got expertise across grounds and water. So there's a variety of different areas in which we have domain expertise, and I think that the growth in DSI is a really exciting opportunity to try and leverage some of those. So what we're going to do is we're going to have Deborah, Lisa, and Bill talk about a little bit about their own perspectives, and the reason we thought we'd assemble the panel this way is so that they could represent 3 different domains, just so you guys know what the thinking was. So Deborah's in environmental science, and she can talk about sort of some of the biophysical dimensions of this and where the opportunities lie there. Lisa's in engineering, and so she's going to talk about some of the technological opportunities. And then Bill is in the policy and economics realm, and so he's going to talk about some of the governance and social science opportunities that exist. So without further ado, I will hand it over to my wonderful set of panelists.
Thank you. So, hi, my name is Deborah Lawrence, and I'm a professor in environmental sciences. And I have long been trying to get into the Data Science Institute to talk about Earth system science, because I think Earth systems has massive amounts of data, and it should be explored in the way that you all think about data, rather than the way we have traditionally been taught to do regressions, or we work with data. We work with data a lot, but I think you have something to offer. Could I see who the data scientists are in the room? Okay, I'm talking to you. Good, because rest of you I actually know. So the things I want to talk about are 2 types of data that I think are especially rich for exploration using the tools of data science. And I will just be upfront that I don't actually know what those tools are, but I'll tell you about my dreams about what you might be able to do for us. And I'm sorry to put it in that way. But I do have some ideas about how it could be, we could work together to figure out some interesting problems. The 2 problems I want to talk about are in the climate system. 2 problems that are bewildering to scientists still, and they are a reason why we don't have a perfect sense about exactly what's going to happen in the future. And they are clouds and oceans. So in the realm of clouds, Andres mentioned all the extreme weather. I want you to picture in your head, because my slides are not there, picture in your head a beautiful blue sky with puffy white clouds. And maybe you don't know how big those clouds are, but they are not 100 kilometers across. But 100 kilometers across is the size of the grid cell that climate models work at. So to get clouds into the models, we have to just put them there using a bunch of empirical relationships and parameterizations based on the properties of that 100 by 100 kilometer cell. By the way, that cell goes from the Earth up to the top of the stratosphere, and from the Earth's surface down many meters, and in the case of the oceans, like 4,000 meters. So there's many cells that are at 100 by 100 kilometers. They go up, they go down. It's rich data at the global scale. So 3 dimensions, and then of course time. And time for us is 30-second intervals. And we do that for 100 years. So think of the data up, down, and around the globe and through time at 30-second intervals. It's rich. And clouds we kind of throw in there, we parameterize them, we sort of throw them in. Well, clouds are really important because if they're in certain heights or certain densities or certain persistence level, they cool the planet. And if they don't stay around, they don't cool the planet. So getting them right is the difference between a lot of warming and not so much warming. So we need to get them right. And I think what you could do, what I think you could do is explore data that we have on clouds in 2 senses. There are remotely sensed cloud data, which again starts at the Earth's surface and comes up. You can measure optical properties from the Earth's surface to wherever the satellite stops measuring. And so we have these observations, we have model data, and I think that there's room to explore relationships that are inherent in the data itself, that are not hypotheses that I would test, but are somehow emergent from the data itself. Like, when do the clouds persist here? Well, it could be about the cells around that cell, or it could be something that's happening halfway around the world at a different level of the atmosphere. Like, you could figure that out. I think you know, I have this hope that you know how to let the data speak to us and inform us about what the hypotheses are about relationships that we might not know exist. Like we work, we think it's happening with arrows into this box from some mental arrows that we have. But I think there's room to explore, why do clouds persist where they do? Why do they act the way they do? Based on what remote sensing data and model data can tell us. So that's one realm where I think it's rich for exploration. How do clouds work? The other area is ocean heat in particular. We have sensors that give us a lot of information about ocean heat. The reason we care about ocean heat, by the way, is that 90% of the heat that's too much heat that we're getting too much of with warming goes into the ocean. Goes into the ocean, and then where does it go? That's a question you all could help us with. It's, we have measurements at various depths. We have an idea about how these major circulation patterns work inside the ocean surface, this conveyor belt that like starts up here and ends up in India. And so we have some ideas, but I have a feeling that with the rich sensor data we now have, we could probably learn more about ocean heat patterns, where the heat goes, how it moves. The reason this matters is because what the ocean does on scales of 10 to 20 years affects our internal variability in the climate system. So it doesn't affect the trajectory of warming, but it affects how we feel it. So if we're thinking about problems in predictability of climate, predictability in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, not 100 years, we got that covered. We know what's going to happen in 100 years. But 10 or 20 years is much harder to predict. Ocean heat content, ocean heat dynamics, that's a big challenge. So these are challenges that I am sure my colleagues in environmental sciences are thinking about, but they're thinking about it the way we've always thought about it, which is whatever way that is. We've got our ways of thinking, our hypotheses, and I think there's room for data science to come in and say, I'm agnostic. I don't know how the system works, and I'm just going to tell you what I see in the data. So that's my fantasy, and I hope you can help us with that.
Okay, I'm next. I'm going to show some pictures. Okay.
Oh, the other picture, you should imagine the ocean. The ocean is lovely and the clouds. Those are your
I'm going to stand up.
I know, I can't do it.
Okay.
I'm gonna
Yeah,
this
you're
right
going to put it
here.
there. Okay. So hi, everyone.
Plug in right here.
I'm Lisa Colosi-Peterson. I'm from the Department of Engineering Systems and Environment, which is the newest department in the School of Engineering. Andres alluded to the fact that we merged in part because we feel that there's a lot of synergy to look at big, important climate problems and others using systems and data approaches. And so I want to start sort of in a similar way to what Deborah said. I actually am quite a novice when it comes to thinking about big data. I've done things the way we've always done them, and I'm convinced that that's not the best way. And so today I'm going to share two snippets of the work that we have done in my group, just to talk about how it is that I'm already convinced that data offers real benefits for the types of problems that we face with the climate, and in hopes of sort of cross-pollinating the conversation and always attracting new collaborators with cool perspectives on how to look at problems. And so Andres also alluded to this emphasis on mitigation. As an engineer, right, it's not just enough to characterize the problem, we also want to mitigate the problem. And so as a framework for these two little snippets that I'm going to show you, I want to talk briefly about what we think about with regard to negative emissions technologies. So not just reducing the emissions that we put out every year, but also, if you can imagine, proactively trying to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, sequester it, hopefully permanently underground, and essentially run climate change in reverse. And so this is what sometimes we'll talk about as climate engineering. These are big systems that will take place across multiple states or multiple countries even. And I'm going to show you some of what that looks like. And so you can imagine that the logistics and the collaboration that will be required to pull this off are essentially unprecedented, and there'll be so much data that's important to sort of evaluate them in advance and sort of understand what they're doing. And so this is some cover art from the National Academies of Engineering report on negative emissions technologies, NETs. You can see that they have several different things that they're thinking about. None of these things is currently in operation yet, but there's an opportunity to really understand what the options are, how crazy they may be, and to try to pick the least crazy of the crazy options. And so my group deals principally with the top two, a direct air capture, which is a very technological sort of brute force approach to sucking carbon out of the air and putting it under the ground. Today I'm going to sort of combine my two snapshots of what we have going on into a discussion loosely about what we call BECCS, that farm that looks like a power plant BECCS is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, BECCS. So essentially we would imagine that we could take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere by growing some organic biomass, some plant material. That photosynthesis would suck the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and then we would do a lot of things, right? And so this is a lot of intensive agriculture on purpose, simply with the goal of taking carbon out of the atmosphere into solid state. And so my one grad student is interested in, as you can see, you're not supposed to learn the steps of this process, but be convinced that if you look at the sequence of steps on the bottom, right, things like grow the biomass, pre-treat it, then use some engineered thermochemical approach to convert it into a mix of complicated, messy products. The most interesting of which, for energy purposes, looks like crude. Then we have to do some stuff with that. Then we have to figure out how to collect the carbon dioxide that comes out of that system and put it underground. And so those are the sequence of boxes that we see on the bottom. Historically, people like me do this in a very slow, sort of clunky way. We parameterize box by box using engineering first principles, technical reports, rolling it into a huge spreadsheet, and then sort of saying, oh, I think there's a distribution of inputs for this parameter, seeing then how distributions of different input parameters together give us some expectation of distributions of outputs. For example, what is the energy yield that this system would give us? I'm putting some energy in, but I'm also getting energy out. With respect to the negative emissions technologies, I'm doing a lot of work, right? And when I'm working, I'm emitting carbon dioxide, hopefully with the goal of having then more carbon dioxide get sequestered by the end of the process than gets emitted during the process. Frankly, I'm skeptical, and so when I tell my students, let's do this project, I'll be shocked if you get more carbon dioxide under the ground than out of the ground, but let's see, right? So suffice to say that this is a complicated system, and we're doing it slowly. And as technologies come online and data becomes available, a dream, like Deborah said, would be to do this much more rapidly, sort of capturing the shape of evolution of technologies. And so as an example, I have that red box there, which is a thermochemical treatment, right? Chemical engineers love to cook things at high temperature and pressure, but we have a lot of waste feedstock that we could cook. And so, I had a grad student who was doing this the hard way, and then with the rise of the merger, she's like, I took a machine learning class. I said, you did? Right? She said, I did. And actually, I think it'd be better if we stopped trying to use like regression in that box. I think we should use machine learning, right? And so she was then able to collect hundreds of studies that people had done sort of as one-offs. And then she was able to really robustly predict what combination of temperature, time, and feedstock properties should go into that box in a way that would dynamically tell us interesting information when we fused it with the bottom box. And so Andres again alluded to life cycle assessment. Life cycle assessment is the systematic way to account for what we think the environmental performance or impacts of a system or a product or a process would be. We were shockingly the first to fuse any kind of machine learning with LCA in a way that lets us run it forwards and backwards. And I feel silly saying this to data scientists, but not only could we sort of say, there's a lot of ways we could do this box, right, including all the things we could put in it, let's stop doing one at a time and instead have the system tell us which combination it likes the most, right? And so actually, we had 3 reviewers, all of which said, it seems obvious now to have tried machine learning with LCA. Why has no one done that? And so, we strongly need the partnership with data scientists. The other thing I want to represent is another graduate student who's here. One of the things that, again, is so crazy about climate change engineering is that we're going to be mobilizing whole countries just to put carbon dioxide under the ground, right? And when you think about places where we can put carbon dioxide under the ground, it's just sort of lucky that the US has quite a lot of those. But we know where they are, and they're not something that we can move, right? And then if you think about it also, we also need access to biomass resources, and those exist in certain parts of the countries. And those places aren't always close to each other. And so things that seem hard on paper are hard in real world. Things that seem hard on paper are sometimes actually harder in the real world if you don't actually know where they'll exist. And so my personal sense is that I'm frustrated with a lot of the work that happens in the global hypothetical. Like, tell me what BECCS will do. How much energy will we yield? How much net carbon will we take out of the atmosphere at the end of the day? I think it's actually impossible to make those estimates if you're not actually layering all of the components of the system. Again, with my boxes on the top left, each of those steps has a footprint that would have to actually exist in some real context. And so if we don't evaluate that step in its real context, how could we know how good a job or a bad job it'll do? And so what we're showing here at the top is that each of those boxes that make up the life cycle, growing the stuff, converting into something else, having the carbon dioxide, putting it under the ground, Each of those steps has its own sort of set of data that have to do with context and characteristics of the system that we would have to put into practice to do that step. And then we can't ignore the fact that we would actually have to build it somewhere in the US. Bill's going to tell you how we would pay for that. But we'd have to do it somewhere for real, okay? And so I'm showing you two different approaches to BECCS. Again, growing stuff with the sole goal of essentially burning it and putting the carbon dioxide under the ground. You could grow terrestrial biomass on your left. You could grow aquatic biomass on your right. And I can try to tell you then what I think it's going to cost you to get all the pieces together at different locations that seem suitable for sequestering. And then when you do it in the real world, as opposed to in the global hypothetical, you can start to come to conclusions like, yeah, some parts of the country, yellow, look better for that heavily engineered system. Some parts of the country look better for this BECCS system that people expect will grow biomass and then convert it into energy and then put the emissions underground. And so this is a lot of data that has to be fused together. Again, in my group, we're doing it by brute force. And we think that, as Deborah has said, there's ways to do this more efficiently and actually really capture the evolution of technologies as they come online. Thank you.
All right, I'm Bill Shobe. I'm an economist. I teach some in the Batten School in the Econ department, and I work a lot on environmental economics, climate change. I feel a little funny speaking at a big data conference. I'm mostly an experimentalist, and my sample sizes are usually 24 or something like that. But that's bigger than 12, so we'll call that big data. But I'd like to talk about economists' use of data and the revolution that's occurring in economics with access to big data. You know, we've heard about engineered systems, and we've heard about climate systems, and now when we think about the socioeconomic system that's layered on top of that, every time we implement a policy to sequester carbon, or every time cloud cover shifts in some way, people are going to make their best response to that change. And so now we have this really complicated next layer on top of what we've already heard about. Every time we try to sequester more carbon, we take resources from one place in the economy, and then there's going to be a behavioral response to that movement of resources. So we have this next layer of complication on top of engineering and on top of environmental science. So now we have three pieces that all have to be accounted for because the behavioral response is going to feed back right into both of these other problems, measurement problems. And so I want to talk about the challenge economists face in using data. And what that means is, of course, first I'm going to have to
Challenge using data.
I'm going to have to figure out how to, end show. That's good. Let me see if I can get the end your show and start my show. And that's here. My screen is microscopic. I can just barely see anything on it. It hasn't adjusted. Let's see if I can see it. All right. And I think that's down here. No, did I hit the wrong one? I did. I hit the wrong one. Okay. Let me just talk about social science in the age of big data. So there are just lots and lots and lots of amazing new sources of data, some of which you're very familiar with and some of which you're not. Some of the sort of early big data to come available for economists was actually administrative records, government administrative records, tax records. In fact, I did my dissertation using a sample of tax records. Anonymized, of course. I never had Donald Trump's taxes, I don't think. As far as I know, no big losses like that. Anyway, so we've been using government records for quite some time, and now we're able to link a lot of government records together. I'm actually on a panel for the state of Virginia right now, considering how to make data on utility customers available so we can understand our electricity use better. Then, of course, we have the corporate data everybody knows about, search data, data on real estate, and all sorts of really cool data available to us now that is only just becoming available. And that is really causing a revolution in the way economists attack some of these problems. Not just climate change, but all the problems we're trying to address. You know, in the past, we think about economists have emphasized, you know, long data. We try to get repeated data, repeated observations about people or about counties or about census tracts, and then observe how things change as circumstances change. And in statistics and computer science, we've had this really amazing diversity of data, but often with a few observations. And now we're in a situation where we have sort of lots of both. And in a sense, there's so much of it that it's hard to wrap our minds around it. But the sky is the limit for us, because now we have this incredibly fine-grained physical and social data that we can bring together to think about the connections between the engineering problem, the environmental problem, and the human problem. One of the things that I'm working with Andres on in this negative emission space is we're trying to help improve some of our global models of our integrated assessment models. Up to this point in time, haven't included the possibility of negative emissions. And in order to do that, we have to think about, well, once we start putting these specs in place, once we start using direct air capture, what is that going to give people incentive to do elsewhere in the economy, and how's that going to feed back into this model we're trying to estimate that tells us about the costs of future climate change? So just a little something about the challenge economists face. I do experiments, sample size 24, in the basement of Monroe Hall, and that's all very wonderful for the topics we can address with experiments. But mostly we can't run experiments. We can't take an economy and run it over again after having changed one of its particular characteristics, right? We'd love to be able to do that. But I will say the Nobel Prize was just granted to 3 economists who do experiments. They set up circumstances where we have real treatment and control groups, and we try to compare behavior. But there's a very limited number of circumstances where we can use these experimental tools, so we have to try to find natural experiments out there. And a natural experiment is a situation where human actors, or firms, are randomly assigned into treatment and control groups by some quirk, by something that happens, a border between counties, the birth date of individuals, the place the firm is chartered. There are just lots and lots of ways people might be thrown into a treatment control group. Children are often assigned to school on the basis of a lottery. Well, that's a real experiment for us. It wasn't intended to be an experiment, but it's random assignment for us. So we need to look for situations where somehow people have been randomly assigned to a treatment and control group. That's a hard problem for economists. And probably most dissertations being written right now are trying to find a way that somebody has been assigned to a treatment group and somebody's been assigned to a control group. But in order to do this effectively, we need really finely grained data. We need information about people in census districts. We need information about people at the block level. We need information about people's homes. So the finer grained our data is, the more likely we are to find circumstances that have thrown people into treatment and control groups. And we can use that as a way of teasing out behavioral responses to things, to all these other factors. So just as an example from climate change, near climate change, is we can use birthplace to help tease out long-term effects of air pollution on people's lifetime outcomes, life outcomes. And that depends on having extremely fine-grained data about people, where they were born, where they ended up the rest of their lives. Okay, now let me just give you a couple of quick other applications. We don't know the biology of some fish, so how might we find out that biology? Well, one way to do it is we can observe fishing effort. And fishing effort, we can now watch vessels as they travel across the ocean and engage in fishing effort. We might be able to use that. In fact, that's being used right here at UVA to help us tease out information about the biology of fish that we didn't know. Building efficiency, an interesting engineering problem. We have all these great engineering estimates of what will happen if we retrofit housing in terms of energy use in buildings. If ex post you go back and evaluate actual energy use, it turns out that generally it's higher than our engineering estimates of what we would have saved otherwise. Well, why is that happening? Are people consuming more energy because now they're getting more comfortable because now their house is more efficient? Or is there something we can learn that will help us refine our engineering estimates? This is something that can be attacked with very room level data over time. And then pollution monitoring, just here's a quick example. If you look at the upper picture, those are this is PM 2.5, fine-grained air pollution data. The upper picture is EPA's sampling network. The lower pictures are satellite data. The satellite data is kilometer square estimates of PM 2.5 concentrations instead of that very non-random data coming from EPA's sensor network. And finally, a really interesting case, one of the problems economists have is measuring the level of economic activity in places around the world in a way that is consistent. And we have really good data in the US by county, even finer grained data, but the rest of the world, it's not so clear. One of the ways we can do this is we can look at nighttime light coming measured from satellites. We can measure the intensity of light as a measure of economic activity around the globe. So here's a case where we have very fine-grained data about the intensity of economic activity in a geographical area, and that can help us understand responses that people make to other policies we implement and other changes. So for economists, it's the dawn of a new age. To give us all this great access to fine-grained data is going to allow us to estimate things that we just dreamed of estimating before. Okay. And that's it. Thanks.
Awesome. Okay, so let me offer a couple of really quick thoughts that came to me as I was listening to the speakers, and then I want to use that time as a warning that I'm going to ask you guys some questions, or ask you guys to offer some questions to the panel. So start thinking about your questions now. So the first observation is that sort of where we are right now these days is that we need to move from sort of observing these socio-environmental systems to predicting and controlling them in a more effective way. And so I think that that's an opportunity for data science to really try and move beyond where we've been. So much of the focus has been on trying to understand what's happening with climate change. That is pretty well understood right now, right? I mean, what's that? Except for clouds in the ocean. There are questions. There are real questions. But the point is that we know. And we've known for a long time. I mean, there were scientists that were explaining the effect that CO2 was going to have on the atmosphere 150 years ago. And so we know. And so the point, though, is that now we have to start bending the curve. And so there is an opportunity there in terms of forecasting, simulation, design, that really needs to be the focus. And I think there's an opportunity for data science. So as an example, Bill's discussion about point source measurements versus satellite-based measurements is a really terrific one, because we are entering a new age of satellite measurement where every time I turn around, there's new satellites by NASA, by other groups being put up that are giving us this really big picture perspective on all kinds of emissions and all kinds of impacts. And but it's coarse, and then we have sensor arrays on the ground, and bridging those is hard to do, and there's a real opportunity there for folks that think about data and think about techniques for trying to fill in the gaps there. That is really exciting, because ultimately, there was a talk by a guy at NASA, a higher up guy, who was talking about NASA's ability to measure emissions, global warming emissions, gases, and he said, we don't want to be the climate police, but there's a real need to start just making that data available and visualizing it in ways that people can understand, because right now people just emit and there's no way to hold people accountable, and so there's a real opportunity there. Lisa talked about negative emissions, and at ERI, the Resilience Institute, we're talking a lot about that as well. So if that's something that's exciting to you and cool, please reach out to us, because we're not sure what shape that push is going to take yet, but we're really interested in making that tent as large as possible. Another thing that occurred to me is, and this became more and more clear as we went down the table, is that there is a real opportunity for folks that are outside of the STEM disciplines to participate in this. And in fact, a lot of the real opportunities for change exist in the social sciences and even into the humanities. And so, these are coupled problems that involve some physical science and applied science, but there are people in the mix, and that's really what's been the sticking point. And so looking at it from an interdisciplinary perspective is really what's key. So we need sort of everybody at the table. So with that, are there questions that you guys have? I've got a few as well, but are there questions that came into your minds as you heard these perspectives about ways that data science and folks thinking about climate can begin to work together? Yeah.
So when you do data science work, as you know, about 80% of your time you end up just munging your data and banging it into shape. And that's a huge barrier to doing any kind of work, and in particular to doing new interdisciplinary collaborations. Do you have any thoughts about how to reduce those barriers, maybe through data standards or through anything? Is there something, so besides the enthusiasm, how can we make those kinds of data science to environmental science collaborations work better?
Gosh, I'm thinking that I thought NASA did some of its own cleaning, but maybe you always have to. It's not cleaning. It's like
it's not just cleaning.
Okay.
It's understanding how the data are structured, and I don't just mean formatting. I mean what it means in jargon ontologies.
Well, that's why we have to actually work together.
Right.
That's why you can't do it or we can't do it. Like maybe.
So there are
conversing.
efforts to create ontologies for environmental data, but those seem like experiments that are off to the side and they're not widely adopted, and they're not really informing active research projects very much, if at all. Any thoughts?
I don't actually even know what ontology of data means.
Yeah.
So
that's
start.
a way of structuring data.
Oh, okay.
It's just metadata. It's
not
just information about the data.
Oh,
right?
Not
okay.
just format, but meaning.
Yeah.
So,
We do have.
There are actually, national networks
Yes.
related to environmental data through
Yeah.
NSF and, say, for example, LTDR program and observing systems. So, for example, the ocean sciences data, handling the data, standardizing the data, organizing the metadata in uniform ways, pretty well advanced. And so person at UVA who would be very knowledgeable about that would be Scott Downey in the Environmental Sciences Department. But so we have certain standards that we have to abide by, and there are data scientists who have been working on that for probably a decade or more. So there may be lessons there by connecting through that could help inform this conversation.
I think economists are way behind, actually, in thinking about data ontologies. I just don't think, and this is an opportunity we have to work with data scientists. We have, some years ago, my center was thinking about building an economics data library for Virginia to gather all the state data we could find. And we started trying to address this issue of thinking about how can we warehouse data in a way that will allow people to assign a machine to come in and take data and use it without a human intervening in the process. Would there be could we provide enough information about the meaning of the data so that you could do that? And I know that data scientists think about this a lot, but it was a hard problem for us, and eventually we decided we weren't in a position to carry out that project because we didn't really know enough about how to do that. So I think that's an area we need to think a lot about, is how to make economic data more friendly to machine searches and extraction. I think it's a really good point.
So how have some other domain areas addressed this issue, right? Because presumably environmental is not the only. I mean, I'm throwing the question back at you, Art, but like, how has questions of ontology been addressed in, I don't know, medicine or some other areas? Has there just been funding from it, from the federal government?
So the only other area where I'll claim the expertise is not even really expertise, but a little familiarity would be with financial data, where there is a lot of ferment in how to describe, say, financial contracts in very richly specified ways. The adoption by the financial industry and the people who actually hold those data and work with them is very low, and efforts to try to create data standards and actually have them adopted have essentially not happened yet. So there's ways, and I think that's roughly a pattern across lots of domain areas.
Yeah, so it'd be cool to think about where there have been success stories, though. If there have been barriers in other industries. Because, I think one of the issues that we face, and I think Bill really articulated this, is that they're coming from a lot of places. It's not just like, in financial world, it's one sort of type of institution that you need to appeal to get them on board with. In the climate system, you're trying out a variety of different types of actors and institutions and players, and so.
Maybe more heterogeneity in the financial world than
Maybe. That's probably true.
I have some questions, but as a follow-on, in biomedical research, they explicitly have a gene ontology, a massive consortium actually, NIH funded, because we have tens of thousands of genes, and they were, for a while, especially in the Drosophila community, the fly community, they were naming genes like discovered on Tuesday. They were a lot of fun, and so they systematized it and created meaning that allowed for summarized meaning, where lots of genes are affected by cancer or processes. So, and then they moved that to clinical ontologies, because now people are exploiting medical data, like data from like our EPIC system, to try to make sense of clinical readouts, and trying to create ontologies for that. So that's an example too of meaning. I have a question about the negative. I'm wondering to what extent are like smaller scale. I know a lot of these things have to be done at scale. It's all or nothing. But I'm wondering to what extent smaller scale experiments, proof of principle, that take you through a whole workflow to see, output versus input, and see the efficacy.
Right, I think there are some very small scale demonstrations, principally on this capture part, the sequestration part. I think it's it's a lot of things that have to go right, and the sequestration has to be essentially permanent and irreversible. And so actually, Andres works on some chemical transformations underground. I think that what you say is we should try it before we do it in large scale. But actually, it's sort of like if you're going to build a well to start injecting CO2 at any rate, it seems like that would be sort of a wasted investment if you can start going full tilt, right? So I think there's a small number, but not significant progress.
Or that kind of research
Right.
that Lisa's doing, you would do that for 12 systems before you picked the one that you would try to build.
But to your point, like how can we model if it doesn't exist, right? And so that's where we try to sort of imagine what it would look like. And my frustration is that a lot of the imagining that we do is done in a very location agnostic way, which makes it an unreal system, right? It's even less real than it could be, and so we have to sort of account for then where are we going to put it, which location,
So two responses to that. One is there was a perspective piece in Nature Geoscience yesterday that basically argued that with negative emissions, people are so wrapped up in this idea that it needs to be deployed at the gigaton scale, right? We're emitting gigatons now. If we want to actually bend the curve, we've got to do it equal and opposite. And that may be counterproductive because there might be a lot of small-scale opportunities, and at the end of the day, it all matters. And so we really need to start nurturing that sort of grassroots approach to climate restoration and negative emissions, which I think was an interesting perspective. So that's one thing. And then, I can't remember the second thing. I had a second response there. But yeah, I think that your point is a really good one. That the climate restoration idea, Lisa's work, this stuff is, where a lot of people are focused now. And like I said, ER is going to do a big push in it, and so we're really excited to work with data science on that. Other questions?
I kind of want to go back to the standards discussion. Because looking for success stories, you have to define what your success is, what the objective function is. And in biology, gene ontology is a good example where there's one standard for defining data and sharing data, but whenever you have a novel methodology, you need to adjust the standard or create a new standard. So really, like having one source of truth for your standard is not desirable. You want to assess it based on what a standard allows you to do. And so if you have some objective in mind for combining economic and environmental data, creating a standard that meets that purpose is more valuable than seeking out that global truth. And that's part of the reason that you don't really find something that's a universal success across any domain.
So is what you're saying that Art had asked about, ontologies for, say, financial data, is what you're saying then that the emphasis should be less on finding this ontology for sort of individual data rather than looking at the places where we want to combine it, and then
Exactly.
So they're really, it's not a productive approach to go data piece by data piece and try to design a sensible ontology.
Don't bother defining everything, because that task will never end.
Yeah, so I think California's seeing that because they passed a low carbon fuel standard and a cap and trade system in the state, and so that created a market for all the type of decarbonization activities that we think about a lot. But the rate limiting step there was the Air Resource Board, who had to sit through and do what Lisa was talking about, old-fashioned way, thinking about each individual unit operation that's involved and verify, because there was real money on the line for each of these processes, and that ended up really sort of putting a big damper on innovation. And so if there, should, and when the US does something, whether it's a carbon tax or a cap and trade program, whatever, that's going to create real opportunities, and anything that will speed up that process, because there's legal and financial ramifications to this, is going to be important. I remember the other thing I was going to say had to do with a talk I was listening to yesterday by Ernie Moniz, who was the Secretary of Energy, the first one under Obama. And he was talking about how difficult it is to predict winners in any technology, and particularly in this negative emissions space. And so I think that the focus that National Academy's report that came out earlier this year that Lisa alluded to, they picked 6 technologies which are sensical, and if I think about it logically, these are the ones that we would go down those roads. But there's no, none of those industries exist today. And so betting the house, literally, the planet's future on one of those technologies when they have huge potential side effects, right, in terms of food, energy, water, all kinds of different health, is possibly problematic. And so picking winners is a tough area to be in. Yeah, Daniel.
Yeah, I basically want to make a plug for one of the next sections which actually addresses this standardization problem. So it's listed here in the schedule as data and open science, but we'll also discuss fair data, which basically means making data understandable to machines so that different systems can interact with each other without the human that you mentioned that needs to be in there most of the time right now. And these discussions, they come up from all corners of research, and there is no magic bullet, as you just described, but there are lots of things that already work in certain circumstances, and standardization and talking about it, and doing experimentation on the standardization, all of that exists. And in that session, we're going to discuss some of that. Actually, we're going to demo how it works by involving the audience in trying to come up with terms that they can mutually understand.
Great. So just in closing really quickly, a few years ago, there were some climate scientists that came up with a simple slogan for talking about climate change that was, they said, it's real, it's us, and there's hope. And I think that, in this context, I would say we've come a long way since that little slogan came out, and I'd say it's big and it's urgent, and we need sort of everybody to participate. And so everybody in this room, whatever your perspective is, there's an opportunity for you to get involved. So come find us, talk to us, and thank you all for coming today and participating.